Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Heart Talk HR. I'm your host, Mihai Noit. It is my absolute pleasure, delight, and a privilege to introduce my guest today, Professor Lynda Gratton. Lynda is the Professor of Management Practice at London Business School, where she directs the HR Strategy for Transforming Organization program, one of the most definite programs for human resources. In the past 20 years, she has worked extensively on the interface of people and organization and written 8 best-selling books. Lynda has been the chair of World Economic Forum Council for Leadership, and she is the only foreigner invited by Prime Minister Abe to join the newly formed Council for Designing a 100-Year Life Society. I asked Lynda to come on a show today to talk about her new book. After writing The 100-Year Life with Andrew Scott, they've written a new book, The New Long Life. And I asked her to come on the show to talk about what are the implications of new long life for organizations, for society, and more importantly, or probably most importantly, we are living longer, but are we happier? So I hope you will enjoy today's episode, and if you do, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. At Heart Talk HR, we bring you fresh ideas and inspiring content from around the world of work. Lynda, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's an absolute delight and privilege having you here with us, and good to see that you are actually sound and safe in today's crazy world. And let me start by asking, you've co-authored your brand new book is out. It came out in the middle of a pandemic. You co-authored with Andrew Scott, The Long New Life, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a sequel on the first best-selling book, The 100-Year Life. Mm-hmm. And in that book, you promise delivering a framework to flourishing in a changing world. And this is more timely now than ever before. But the pandemic is not just about a health issue. It's a very complex questions around organization and implications on society. So let's start talking about the framework itself, and how do you suggest it can be used in today's turbulent times when the only norm is change?
Well, thank you so much for the question. And actually, I need to show you the book with the subtitle, A Framework for Flourishing in a Changing World. So whilst we might not have used the pandemic, Andrew Scott, my co-author, who by the way is an economist, and I were very aware of the fact that the world was changing fast. And in fact, in the book, we talked about the 3 big trends that we were seeing. Obviously, one around technology and the impact of technology on our jobs. Secondly, the whole demographic shift, which obviously we talked about earlier in the 100-Year Life, the fact we're living longer, healthier, even with COVID, by the way. COVID doesn't seem to have impacted, how long you're going to live, unless you are obviously unfortunate enough to catch it badly. And then thirdly, the social trends, women working, family sizes getting smaller, and as a consequence, an aging population. So we talked about a framework for flourishing. Well, what did we talk about? Well, we said there were 3 aspects that were going to be incredibly important in terms of how each one of us flourished. The first was really about our identity. You know that traditionally our life was seen as 3 stages: full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement. Now that's obviously changed to something much more complex in terms of multi-stage lives. And that means we come in and out. So already our identity across our whole lifetime has changed. But actually more than that, the way that we now live in terms of technologies and so on, we have a lot more choices available to us. And that's why this notion of possible selves, the idea that at any point in time, you can think about the platform of resources you've got and really think about, what could I do in the future? What could be my new possible self? That's a really interesting idea. So the first part of framing the framework of flourishing is around identity. The second, which of course is very important right now, is about learning and exploring. it's never been more important to learn right the way through our lives. And that, of course, has implications for both us as individuals, but also the organizations that we're members of, and indeed our governments. And the third, which again is coming up very importantly during COVID, is about our social interactions, our networks, the way that we manage our networks, and indeed our families, right the way through my writing. And I was just reminding myself of, I have this next to me at the moment. It's a book called The Shift that I published in 2011.
It's also on my bookshelf, by the way.
Yes. Well, actually, I looked back at this only yesterday because I've been keeping a diary. I'm, by the way, now on volume 4. In fact, I can show you. It just started, volume 4. There it is. Oh, no, I tell a lie. Pandemic, volume 5. And actually, I was just reflecting. London Business School asked me to do a big piece over the weekend. I was just reflecting on what I'd learned. And actually, right the way through my writings, right the way from The Shift, I've said, we've got to think more about families. We've got to think more about communities. And I think the pandemic, more than anything, has brought us back to our families and brought us back to our communities. So no surprise that the third aspect of flourishing is to do with how you interact with your own family and the time that you give to your family and indeed to your community.
Wonderful. Your previous book, The 100-Year Life, actually, you've covered quite extensively on the implications for corporations and particularly for HR. Indeed, what HR needs to do and needs to prepare for in order to support the individual through the 100-year life, especially when you say it's no more of a block of work and a block of retirement thereafter. Considering the new long life, what would you suggest? Most of our listeners are HR professionals and practitioners. What would you suggest? How should they look at the new long life in terms of designing and future-proofing their people strategy?
Well, I think, and for your listeners, please do drop me a note if you're interested. I have a whole set of resources that I've been building during COVID. Just drop me a note, either at LinkedIn or at London Business School. Obviously COVID is taking up all of HR's time right now, the development of hybrid working practices and so on. But I think it's really important that we keep on looking at the longer term. We keep the short and the longer term in our minds, particularly as we're moving into what might be a really difficult recession next year. So I think, right now, the issue for HR is, how do you narrate a future? How do you build a sense of the future that people find compelling? And how do you engage people in conversations about the future? It's been really interesting. Just recently, we worked with one of the insurance companies, and we trained a random sample of 10% of their employees in the future of work, and then engage them in a big conversation about, okay, what should we now be doing in the future? And I think that concept of co-creation really sits at the heart of what it is to be an HR professional right now. I mean, we can't possibly have all the answers. So certainly what I've been doing in my advisory group, HSM, is to engage people across the organization in imagining their future, but also training them to know what it could be. There's no point in having a conversation with thousands of people who don't really know much about the future. So actually training large swathes of the employee groups in what is the future, what is the future of work. We found that incredibly exciting.
Very interesting. And what we've seen during the pandemic is that organizations are able to move thousands, 10,000, 100,000 people to home offices. And there's no problem with technology, no problem with processes, but it certainly does have a massive emotional toll on people, especially some of those who are more extrovert than introvert. They miss the social interaction. And it's also quite challenging when it comes to leading and managing teams and managing organizations. Let's talk about leadership for a moment, shall we? Do we need an update in leadership in regards to how we're leading organizations in the next norm post-pandemic? How does leadership change? How is leadership changing in the future?
Well, I think, as you say, leaders have been under enormous pressure, and we've been following, we have a survey which we've been using right the way through the pandemic. And I've also done a couple of webinars specifically about leading in a pandemic. And I think, leaders have gone through an emotional journey themselves they're now finding, I've talked to CEOs who have hardly seen any employees at all. They've been talking to employees through a Zoom. And actually the employees have loved that. They've loved the fact they've seen their CEO in their home, looking casual, engaging with them one-to-one. So from the employee perspective, I think that they've really learned a great deal about what it is to be a leader. I think from the leader's perspective, it's been very, very difficult. And so what I see as we move through the pandemic and move into what might be the new norm, I think, being a leader is partly about managing your own emotions and health. And I do think that we have to be really careful about that, because I think leaders are under a lot of pressure right now. I think secondly, the role of the leader is to narrate a future that seems positive. People say, and we see this from our own surveys, very few people want to go back to where they were. And so going back isn't on the cards, but what is then has to be described is what the future could be. And that narrative that shows people the upside of the future, I think is incredibly important. And thirdly, of course, it's just about how do you lead in a virtual world. And, as I wrote a book called Hotspots years ago, which was about teams. And I talked quite a bit there about virtual teams, which were beginning to be developed 15 years ago. And actually, it turns out leading a virtual team, managing a virtual workforce is not the same as really focusing on people that are sitting right next to you. And that requires a great deal more processes, actually, but also an opportunity to get rid of some of that awful bureaucracy that people were beginning to hate in organizations.
Interesting, many of your book, The Hotspot, The Shift, The Future of Work already is here. This is something probably leaders need to start reading again, because it seems like all these ideas you shared years ago, it became, the shift hasn't really happened yet. And now COVID forced organization to shift, like to make it actually real change and real shift. So your ideas and your thinking probably is more relevant now than ever before.
Well, actually, just by the way, I run a program at London Business School, but obviously that's face to face. But I have just launched at London Business School a virtual program on the future of work. That the first iteration is running in November 2020. So do sign up for that if you're interested, as fascinated as I am in the future of work. But yes, I think the message is really crucial, and part of the reason I've written so much during this pandemic is because I realized this was my moment to talk to leaders about what they should be doing next. And I've been doing a lot of webinars with CEOs and often their teams about, what next? Because this is very much an evolving story. What I talked about in March the 14th, when I went down to lockdown, was not the same as I'm talking about now. So I think it's really important that leaders think deeply about the decisions that they're making now, particularly in terms of fairness. My current worry is that the way that we're developing the next iteration of work, we're doing it so quickly. Some leaders are making very snap decisions, such as nobody's going back to work. We're all going to be working at home. By the way, I think that's a mistake. I wouldn't advise a leader to do that now. But nevertheless, issues of fairness and justice and trust, I think, are going to be really moving up the agenda. And certainly for those of you in the HR profession, I would be very thoughtful about implications of fairness and trust to some of the judgment calls you're making right now.
You've mentioned it's a mistake if you ask your people to work from home. So what would you suggest? What is the right way to work in the next norm? Are we asking people to go back to the office? Obviously, we cannot get everybody back in the office because people got used to working remotely. So what's the right balance in working virtually, working from home for the organization? What would you suggest?
Well, I'm not against home working. In fact, I think it's a good practice. What I think is what I wouldn't have recommended right now is to say to an employee group, you will now be working from home and there is no office for you. Remember that in terms of actual research on home-based working, we've only got one study. We have one proper, balanced experimental study of home-based working. And for those of you who know the study, that was in Chinese call centers. It was in a Chinese call center. And half of the call center people went to work from home, half of them stayed in the office. And Nick Bloom, who did the research, was able to measure productivity, because you can measure productivity of call centers pretty easily. What he found is that people who work from home were more productive, and they were more productive primarily because they worked longer hours. But what he also found is that half of them wanted to go back to work again. And even for the home workers, they still worked from the office 1 day a week. So what's happening now is we're using that experimental process, which was with call center workers, and now saying, oh, the same is true for knowledge workers. There has been no experimental work on home working with knowledge workers. So companies, CEOs who are saying, we all need to work from home now, are basing that not on experimental data, but on their own N of 1. You know, Nick Bloom, I think, had an N of 300. We're now down to an N of 1. You know, what are your experiences? What are my experiences? That's not enough. And what we know is that in some jobs, serendipitous conversations are really important. So my view is that we will have offices. They'll become places more of social interaction, and we have to design those right now. And I think home working is great for people who need to, a lot of my work I do at home. I have an office at home now. I always have. You know, I have an office at London Business School. I have an office in my advisory group, HSM, in Covent Garden. But I actually do most of my work at home because I'm a writer. So I need to be undisturbed. So, you know, it seems to me that we've heard the voice of employees a lot. Now we need to hear the voice of the job. What does the job say? And there are some jobs where working from home is absolutely perfect. We've always known that call center workers can work at home. BT found that 15 years ago. But some knowledge work where you're constantly with each other, then you need some sort of community space. It doesn't have to be called an office, but you do need to get together. And that's why you're noticing that workers are coming back because they want to meet each other. I ran a webinar on the 15th of March for London Business School, where we had 3,000 participants. And I asked a question, tell me about how you're feeling right now. And gave them various options. 14% said the technology isn't working. That's really low. 43% said, I'm missing the social interaction of the office.
Yeah, I mean, curious to see in the next few years what sort of concrete data and academic research we shall be gathering from the current
there's
situation.
Lots of experiments. I mean, all the data will be coming out next year, but right now, you know, companies are making decisions without proper data.
Indeed. Very interesting. Finally, last but not least, we are living longer. There are 100-year life. There is a new long life ahead of all of us. But are we happier? And I don't mean to be too philosophical, but the fact is that stress is on the rise in developed world. The abuse of subscription drugs on the rise in developed world. So are we happier? And if not, what can be done, especially in a sort of a lockdown era when anxiety is even higher? What can be done to find grit, to find resilience, and be happier in a long new life?
Well, actually, it's such an interesting question, and it's a question that Andrew and I address in the New Long Life, you know, because clearly if you have a short and brutal life, then happiness isn't going to be part of it, as people would have had in the medieval age. But now, you know, many of us are going to live probably healthily into our 90s. My generation will possibly live healthily into our 90s. Our kids are going to live into their 100. So there's a wonderful opportunity to build happiness right the way through your life. How do you do that? Well, that's really where that fundamental framework comes in. First of all, think about your own identity, particularly think about the way that you age. You know, a lot of our notions of age are very stereotypical. Those of you who know me will know that I often say, I'm 65 years old. And the reason I do that, which is unusual, of course, for a woman to say her age, is to say, I'm 65 years old, get over it. This is what 65 is. And I think it's taken us time to catch up with the fact that we're aging better. I do not look or act like my grandmother did at 65. I'm sure my children will act differently when they're 65. So we have to think about these wonderful long lives we've got. And actually, one of the areas that Andrew Scott and I are still working on is about the distribution of time. We've said, that if you think about only the short term, then you're constantly looking to maximize your happiness in the short term. But if you think about your whole life, you have an opportunity to redistribute time. So for example, rather than saying, I'm going to be retired for 30 years at the end of my life, why not take some of that time and move it back and take a year off now, take a gap year now, travel now. I cannot wait to travel again. I'm itching. Nigel and my husband and I are crazy travelers, and we've had this. We were in the Congo a couple of years back, and we've had this plan to get to Benin, to take a look at Benin, and I just can't wait to go. So, I think whatever makes you happy. I love traveling around the world. You have a chance in a long life to do all these wonderful things, and I mean, lockdown has been tough for all of us. I should not really make any sadness because I have a wonderful life, but there is a real sense of loss for all of us. As you said, Andrew and I published this wonderful book. Well, I've never seen anybody read it. I've never seen it in a bookshop. We didn't have a book launch. Our kids didn't have a graduation. They didn't have a marriage. So look, it's absolutely clear that this has been very tough for all of us. And for some people, it's been absolutely dreadful. But it will pass. And, building resilience during this period, I think is very important. And that's about thinking about your identity, really trying to keep on learning. It's interesting. The CEO of Coursera was telling me that the learning downloads for Coursera had gone up 300% within a month of lockdown. And thirdly, really spend time with your family and friends. At the end of the day, as you know, that very famous longitudinal study of happiness, that the Harvard study shows that at the end of the day, the thing that makes you most happy are family and friends. And that's the one thing that we have during lockdown.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynda, for your insights and wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is out now, New Long Life, Flourishing in the Changing World. So it's available on Amazon. And if people would like to get in touch with you, what is the best way to find out more or get in touch or learn about you?
Well, either LinkedIn, go to my website, or else send me an email, lgratton@london.edu, and I have a whole set of resources to download around the pandemic.
Wonderful, Lynda. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and delight. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button.